Okay then, so we've looked at identifying and understanding the nature of the problem, the scope of the problem, the impact, and you've just looked at some problem solving techniques, and hopefully you've done your activity and uploaded that part to your activity, and then you went on to watch a video by Tony Robbins talking about decision making as a force in business. Now the video is slightly different and it's talking about people running their own business primarily, but there are lots of good points in there. He talked about the differences that it can make if we make a good decision or a bad decision, and he was talking about it in life, but it's true in our jobs as well. It can make a massive impact on our careers, and we're not always going to get it right. And something I was always taught in the forces that no decision is a decision as well. So doing nothing is a decision, and it's not a best one either. Better to make a decision and do something and then be able to evaluate it. And we're going to look at some techniques which help you look back at that decision and evaluate it. He talked about making sure there was a focus, and we'll look at some techniques that can sort of put a focus of what we should concentrate on. He talks about it being a pattern, which is a process, which would be some of the techniques we'll look at. He talked about decisions, that leaders make decisions, and he talked about how those can impact on everyone else, and planning and having some sort of techniques that we've looked at will not necessarily mean that we'll make the right decision, but it will give us a process that we can then go back and evaluate and reflect on, so that we can show or justify why we made those decisions, not just that we guessed it. So it was more general. Hopefully it was motivational though, about making decisions, and it's about being in the right place, and the feeling he was emphasizing, because you've got to feel positive, and you've got to have, and part of that is being prepared and have looked at what the nature was, what the scope is. Fully understanding it helps you be in that positive frame of mind to look at the options and make the right decisions. So let's have a look at some decision making techniques that we could use in making those decisions. So we're going to consider four. Well, there's sort of five in there, but two really go together. And the first is pros and cons, or weighted decision grids. We're going to just briefly go through these, and then we'll look at them more, each of them an example. So the first one is just pros and cons, just based on outlining advantages and disadvantages, and we'll talk more about that, but very simplistic. But weighted grids is where you can have several options and you can score them against each other and make some sort of decision. We're then going to move on and look at decision trees, which is really about mapping out possible outcomes with a series of choices, and it does allow to compare a multitude of things in one sort of area and comes out with an outcome. We'll then look at Pareto analysis, which is good at prioritizing what is the key thing you should do, which change should you do first, working on a lot of statistical data, but it is very good at sort of allowing you to work out which change or which decision you should make first, and which, if you can only make one, could get you to the best outcome. And then we'll look at paired comparison analysis. So looking at relative importance between two options. It's really good if you've got options that have got a subjective nature to them, or two completely different sort of areas to look at. So we'll analyze those in the next few slides. So firstly, we'll just take a quick look at pros and cons, because it's very simple, and all we're literally talking about is brainstorming the advantages, disadvantages for each option. So pro meaning for, con meaning against. You can see there's an example on the screen. For, it'll be a quick solution, it's low cost, it's simple to do, and against, it's short-term solution, it won't please staff, customers might notice, competitors don't do it, and then it could be a bit immoral. So we might be talking there about, I don't know, decreasing the size of a chocolate bar instead of increasing the cost. But good if you have a group of people doing it, because there's more brainstorming going to go on rather than doing it on your own. But you can do it on your own for simple problems. Next, we'll look at weighted decision grids, and this is a little bit more sophisticated and not so subjective. It's a process designed for more complex decisions, where you've got a number of options and you're going to score them against different categories to give them what they call a weighting, and whichever ones of those factors is the heaviest weighting is going to give a heavier score, therefore bring an outcome. But I think the easiest way is to look at an example. So we've got an example on the screen as a table come up, and that's the sort of grid you'd use for doing it. So in this example, we're talking about perhaps, I don't know, some new suppliers and who's going to supply the stuff and the factors along the top. But the first step is that you put all your options down the side. For example, in this side, like we said, there's 4 different suppliers that we could make purchases from. The next section is to score them against the factors, and in this case, and you decide the factors, but in this case, the factors have been decided that it's about the cost, the quality, the location, the delivery, the payment options, so whether you have to pay up front, whether you can pay on interest-free credit, etc., and then a total. And you score them against them probably, and you decide your own scale, but for example, in this one, using 0 as poor and 5 as very good. Once you've done that, you will work out the relative importance of all the factors. So as you can see, just come up on the screen now, we've got different numbers, so 1 up to 5, with 5 being the most important and 1 being the least important. I must mention here that you can have similar factors with similar weighting, so you could have 2 2s or 2 3s. It's purely up to you about which you see as most important, and if you see them as the same importance, then that's absolutely fine. The next step is to multiply the score that you put down against each factor with the weighting. So for example, in the first one there, supplier 1 against cost, 1 times 4 is 4, and then you do that across the board. So as you can see now, we've done that for the other examples, and then total it up, and the total for the supplier 1 came to 22. Now I'm not going to go through and do them all individually, but you now add them all, times them, and then add them all up, and the one with the highest total is your preferred supplier in this case, or your preferred option. So that was a weighted decision grid. The next one we look at is decision trees, and it's about to come up on the screen, but it can look quite confusing, and it can look like a set of tree roots the other way around, but it does give a visual map of choices you can make and possible outcomes between a series of simple yes and no or 2 option choices, which can take you to an end outcome. So the example on the screen is probably obvious, but it's for credit checks. It's looking at coming up with a risk factor for loaning people money, and you can see the outcomes at the end of things such as high risk, medium risk, high risk. Those green, red, orange boxes at the end of the routes, as you might call it. So it starts with the income, it looks at how much the amount of the income is, and then if you're in a bracket that are not high risk, then it looks at your credit history, unknown, good or bad, the 3 choices, and then it decides what the outcome of that was, whether you're high risk, medium risk, or in some options, the unknown, it goes, have you got any debt, high or low. So you can see from this, it's not actually made any decisions for anyone, but it does help inform or justify a decision. And you still got to make a decision or set a criteria at the end of this one, for example, where you say we will loan to medium and low risk people, but not high risk people. But that would be a decision to be made. But the tree helps us to get to that decision. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it helps us to get to the decision. It can be very useful in setting out the process as you try and work out the problem or what could be causing the issue, and it helps you to sort of get to the decision. But ultimately, someone's still got to have some criteria there to make the decision. So decision trees help you plan out what possible evidence there is to make the decision in some respects. So can become quite complicated. That's quite simple. When there's lots more choices, I have seen ones that have just, it's hard to work out what's going on. There's just branch after branch after branch coming off. But in certain points, it can be quite useful to get it down on a piece of paper and think, right, so here are options. If this happens, we go here. If that happens, then this could be the outcomes. And then you can visualize what's going on. So we'll now look at the Pareto analysis. So now we'll have a look at Pareto analysis, a statistical technique usually used when we're looking at data. So we've got lots of figures or numbers or reports of something, and it's a way of prioritizing or selecting the best option that's going to have the most impact. So the one that's going to have the biggest impact. What tasks, what things can we do that will have the biggest impact on the objective we're looking at, solving the problem? So what's going to make the greatest difference? It uses the Pareto principle, which you may have heard of, and that's also known as the 80-20 rule. If you haven't heard of it, it's all about looking at what is going to make the most impact. So the theory can also be called law of the few, because it talks about the few tasks, the 20% of tasks that make 80% of the difference. Okay, and that other 80% are seen as trivial or minor tasks, and they don't have as big an impact. Their 80% have a 20% impact. It's not as simple as that, really, because as we probably all recognize, those trivial or minor tasks may support those vital tasks, but the actual tasks that have the impact are quite small in comparison to the effects. So they're the big things. So for example, it might be, for example, in problem solving, which we're talking about, it might be the planning and preparation at the beginning, and the identifying of what the problem actually is the thing that's going to have the most impact on your problem solving. Because if you don't do it, you're not going to get to the end problem in the end. So the vital tasks, the 20%, is not the biggest time thing, because that'll be getting on and solving the problem, but the planning and preparation can have a massive impact on the outcome. And this analysis does stimulate creative ideas. It helps to organize problems and break them down into their sort of constituent parts. So let's have a look at how we might put it into practice step by step. So it's a step-by-step process, really. And step one is like any problem. It's about taking a step back, identifying or listing the problems. So writing them all down, breaking them down, talking to clients, talking to team members, getting input from all sorts of data, such as surveys or help desk logs or error reports, and trying from that to go to step two and identify the root causes. So we're talking about getting past the symptoms and identifying the things that are actually causing the problem. From them, we score them or we rank them. Now that'll depend on the problem. You'll choose the scoring. So if it's about profits, it might be on a basis of how much it's costing you. If it's about improving customer satisfaction, then it might be about the number of complaints, but you're going to score it on the impact it's have. And then you group them together by the root cause. So that's about pulling them together and seeing what has actually caused the problem that you've broken down. Once we've done that, we add up all those totals by group, and whichever one scores the highest is probably the highest priority, and the one that scores the lowest is the lowest priority. And that doesn't mean we don't deal with the one of the lowest priority, it just means that we use these to make plans and take action. So we try and impact the ones that are going to have the most effect. So we try and do the ones that are going to have the most impact. So they were the highest scoring ones. So let's have a look at an example. So in our example, say you've just taken over, I don't know, a customer service team, and you know they're performing poorly. You know that because there's a lot of customer service surveys that have put them in a bad position. There's a lot of complaints that have identified poor performance. But where do you start? Well, first, step one, as we said, you would look at all the problems. 2, try and find the root causes, and 3, score them. And you might do that by the number of surveys or instances that have been reported. So let's say that after you've done all that, you come out with some trends, and the trends are that some of the complaints are based on lack of training. 35% of those 35 surveys out of the ones you collected about the responses to complaint identify it as lack of training. You've grouped it as that. 20 of them are on too few staff available, and 5 are based on poor organisational preparation. And quite often, if there's a lot more than this, things such as graphs created in Excel can be useful, but as you see there, they're all scaled on the thing. So we can look at this and start thinking about what we would do, and prioritising giving staff more training is what it looks like. And you might think, well, what about the other things? But if we prioritise that training, it may have an impact on the poor organisation and preparation, because better trained staff might be more organised and more prepared, and also better trained staff It might not be that there was not enough staff, it might just be that they're not being effective as they need to be. So if they've got better training and they're more effective, that might also have an impact on not enough staff. So better to start with the lack of training. If it doesn't impact the others, then we can look at those later, but we can't do all three of them in one go. So Pareto analysis has identified that our main area we should target should be the lack of training. Obviously there's only three options in this, but sometimes there's much more to look at, and Pareto analysis can be quite good when we're looking at large amounts of data and figures, numbers about our complaint. So that's Pareto analysis, and now we're going to look at the final one, which is paired comparison analysis. Relative about looking at importance of different options. In that classical case when they're not things that match up, so it may be about comparing apples with oranges, so problems that don't seem to match, and it gives you a good subjective way of looking at those. Enough of me talking about it. Watch the video on paired comparison analysis.